Hi guys, welcome to another episode of the Drunken Boxing Podcast, still coming to you from the capital of the Middle Kingdom, Beijing, China. In case you haven't heard, listeners of the podcast are still able to enjoy a 10% discount on all of Dynasty Clothing and Gear's awesome items. They make both martial arts training clothing and equipment, as well as lifestyle clothing. Their items are of high quality with really great designs, and they embody the spirit of the martial arts fully as well. So go on over to their website at dynastyclothingstore.com and have a look. At checkout, use the code MUSHIN, that's MUSHIN, and you will receive a 10% discount on your order. In other news, on the Mushin Martial Culture YouTube channel, I have released part 3 of my Bagua Zhang 10-minute primers, which further introduces foundational basic skills and practices for you to learn. Also, I have started releasing the footage from the historic Bagua Zhang gathering, which took place in 1993 in Beijing. I'm subtitling the series, which translates the commentary by Professor Kanga Wu, and I'm also adding information regarding each performer that was not originally included. I hope you guys find these interesting. Once again, I appreciate any and all support for both the Drunken Boxing Podcast as well as the Mushin Martial Culture YouTube channel and all the endeavors that I do through my Patreon. We have a Patreon. It's been set up just for a couple of months. If you enjoy these endeavors, want to assist me and support me in continuing to do both the podcast and whatever else we release on the Mushin Martial Culture YouTube channel, pop on over to the Patreon page and you can pledge what you can pledge there. There's a couple of tiers. The Patreon page is, you can find it at patreon.com/Mushin Martial Culture. The links are in the show notes. And once again, I appreciate any and all support. Alright, let's get into today's show. My guest today is Marcus Brinkman. Marcus Brinkman is yet another early pioneer from the USA to travel to East Asia in pursuit of his studies, which included both medical studies as well as martial studies. He eventually ended up in Taiwan, where he studied under Hong Yixiang directly and then under Luo Dexiu as well. He has spent many years practicing the arts of Bagua Zhang and Xingyi as handed down through this lineage, and he currently is still residing in Taiwan, where he continues his medical and martial practices and is also teaching. It was very interesting to hear about his early experiences. His contact details, as well as a link to his YouTube channel, are in the show notes. So, let's get right into it. I bring you Marcus Brinkman. All right, welcome, Mr. Brinkman, to the Drunken Boxing Podcast. I'm very happy that you agreed to record this episode with me. I'm sure there are quite a few people that are more involved in the arts of Xingyi and Bagua Zhang that actually are familiar with your name. But of course, a lot of people might not have heard who you are. So, firstly, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much, Byron.
And maybe for the people and the general audience out there, if you could do just a very brief, an introduction. Doesn't have to be brief, just an introduction about yourself, your background, etc.
Okay, probably the more recent history of my martial arts training, I'll start with when I came to Asia, and that was in 1985. I moved to Hong Kong.
Wow. Okay.
From the United States. And I spent off and on about a year in Hong Kong. And I went to the Chinese Hong Kong University there. And while I was there, I studied with a few people outside of the internal martial arts and had a few Chinese medical doctors or teachers there.
Okay.
And about a year after, I moved to Taiwan. And from there, I primarily studied with Hong Yixiang, and then later on his disciple, Luo Dexiu. And that's a primary breakdown of at least my time in Taiwan is with those two particular teachers.
Yeah, and both of those teachers, I mean, for the people that have been involved, especially some of the older generation people that have been involved in Xingyi and Bagua Zhang, those are prominent names. Was there a particular reason why you went to Hong Kong? Was it martial arts related? Is that why you left the States? Were you in search of martial arts? Was it something else that drove you?
It was actually both martial arts and Chinese medicine. I was actually making my living as a Chinese doctor before I left the States, and actually had a pretty healthy practice.
Mm-hmm.
But I met somebody that was living in New Territories,
Okay.
right outside Hong Kong, and in fact, right next to the Chinese Hong Kong University, and who kind of encouraged me to head east and continue with more Chinese medicine and martial arts practice.
Oh, so you did have a background already in both those disciplines already in the United States prior to going to Hong Kong?
I did for many years actually. Yeah.
Was there a particular style of martial arts that you had focused on back then before leaving?
Well, actually, just before I left, I was Kumar Francis had moved to the Denver area where I was living at, and I practiced with Kumar for a couple of years. And before that, I did a number of different Chinese and some Japanese martial arts.
Very interesting. Well, yeah, Kumar BK, as most people know him, BK Francis also has a connection with the Taiwanese groups of these arts. He traveled through there quite early and also came to the mainland. Did that influence you in your decision to come out here as well?
Well, it did, basically just in terms of connections. Kumar, having studied in Taiwan before I had come to Taiwan, it seemed that Hong Yixiang would be a natural, an easy connection if I actually ended up in Taiwan,
Right.
which I did. So that was influential from that point of view.
Right. Of
Yeah.
course. And you went through to Hong Kong first, and while you were there, you were studying some Chinese medicine. You were furthering your studies in Chinese medicine. And
Yeah, I actually studied Mandarin at Chinese Hong Kong University,
Oh, that's interesting.
and the person I was living with right outside the university, there's a little village, Chek Nai Ping, and it's a little Hakka village, and he lived down below, and I was his roommate for most of the time that I was in Hong Kong, and I met a few teachers there. I studied actually Choi Foot at the university with a pretty famous teacher. I can't
Okay.
remember his name, but he's a cross-eyed practitioner. That's a lot of people know him because he had this trait of cross-eyed.
I think I might know who you're
Look.
talking about. I think he eventually, well, he's passed away, but his younger brother is in the USA, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. I apologize for not remembering his name. It's already 30, 40 years ago. And
For
Choi
sure.
Fat was never my main system, but I did enjoy practicing it when I was at the university. And then I had another teacher in Hong Kong that was originally from the Beijing Opera
Okay.
and ended up in Hong Kong. And he was also a Taiji Xingyi Bagua practitioner. Yuan Shaoling, I believe, was his family name.
Oh, actually, now that
But
you've just jogged my memory, I think the Choi Lei Foot guy's name was Li Kun Hung. I think that was him.
that's right.
Okay, yeah. So Li Xiu
I'm
Hung is
sure.
his brother, who's still teaching in the USA. Sorry, that just jumped into my head, so I thought I'd get it out there before I forget it again.
Yeah, and I believe I met his brother as well because I think his brother was kind of the main instructor at the Chinese Hong Kong University at the time.
Right, yeah. Very good teachers, and they're very prominent practitioners of the style. And Choi Lei Foot, along with Hungar and some other of the Hakka styles, are quite and Wing Chun, of course, is quite popular in Hong Kong. But as you said, I mean, it wasn't your main focus, and
Well, at that time, I would have taken anything. I was looking for teachers new in Hong Kong, and that happened to be the most convenient thing. So
yeah, of course.
I think it was only like $10 a month or something like that. You got a free pair of pants and T-shirt.
Sounds like a good deal.
It was a great deal. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, then you were mentioning the next person that you'd also moved on to study from there, and he was a Beijing opera person. Yeah.
Yeah, he was affiliated with the Chinese Hong Kong University and taught young style Taiji. And I started taking his young style Taiji class, and I'd studied Dong Taiji and Chen Panling Taiji in the States before I came. And when I got to know this particular teacher, I found out that he was also a Xingyi and a Bagua guy. So I tried my best to learn whatever I could from him before I left Hong Kong.
Okay. So was Xingyi and Bagua what you had? You had some experience with that previously with BK Francis. So was that a style that you showed, or you felt some affinity for, something that you felt that was those were the styles that you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, I think in particular Xingyi at the time was what I was looking for, as well as Taiji. So I had some background in both Taiji and Xingyi before I came to Taiwan, and I hadn't studied Bagua yet.
Okay. All right, very interesting. And from there you decided to move on to Taiwan. Was that just luck of the situation? Was that something you had planned? How did that?
It was more of a fluke. It was more of a fluke because I had met some people, a lot of Taiwanese or foreigners that live in Taiwan would do their visa runs to Hong Kong.
Okay.
And I met a couple of people from Taiwan doing their visa runs there, and they asked me, said, what are you doing in Hong Kong? Why are you in Hong Kong studying Mandarin?
That is a bit strange, I must admit.
Yeah, that just tells you how little I really knew about where to go at the particular time. But it was just the opportunity to get to Hong Kong that kind of got me there in the first place. But hearing that, I really started to do more research and found out that Taiwan was really a much better atmosphere to be in
Right.
according to what I was there for.
Oh, for sure. I'm sure at that time too. I mean, Hong Kong is a bustling business hub, and you're trying to pursue cultural, medicinal, and other aspects of, well, martial, of course, other aspects of learning. I would think that Hong Kong is not the ideal situation to pursue those. I mean, of course, the Hong Kong styles that are very strong amongst the local practitioners, but as a foreigner, I would assume it's not as easy to pursue those things in Hong Kong as it would be in Taiwan.
That's the absolute truth. And as well in Taiwan, I could make a living teaching English while I was pursuing my medical and martial arts practice.
Of course, of course. And in Hong Kong, there's a lot, at that time, definitely, there was a lot more English than Taiwan had. So I guess that type of an opportunity would have been a lot smaller or more rare in Hong Kong.
I think you're exactly right. Yeah.
So you arrived in, I mean, I want to ask you a question that is something that it affected me. I mean, when I decided to go down the path of martial arts when I was young, and I decided to pursue it as much as I could in my country that I was living in, and then I moved on to Asia. How did your family take this? Because that's always an issue for us.
Well, I didn't go to Hong Kong. I think I was 28 years old when I left to Hong Kong. And I hadn't really been dependent on my family for many years at that point. And I was partially raised by an aunt of mine as well. So
Okay.
my direct family ties didn't have that much influence on whether I stayed or
Right,
went
right.
to Asia. Yeah.
I guess that might have made it a bit easier for sure. I mean, I always had a bit of your family tries to think about the future and your career and what are you going to do in the future. So that's always a thing that we get because it's not seen as a viable path to go down in terms of future prospects in terms of employment and whatever. Here you are chasing your dream when your family in general, I mean this is definitely my case and a few other people, when your family in general is trying to tell you to be more pragmatic and think more realistically about real world goals and whatnot. But I mean, that's never going to stop people like you or myself either. So I was just interested to hear if you had any of those experiences.
No, and I think that's for most people I've met in Asia, that really is maybe the primary factor in determining whether they, want to pursue some study in Asia is how their family thinks about it, and their support of their family as well. I think in many cases.
For
So.
sure, for sure. So yeah, moving on, you arrived in Taiwan. I mean, this must have been a whole new world for you.
Oh yeah, and it happened to be a much better environment immediately, just because most people spoke Mandarin
Right,
in Taiwan, where in Hong Kong everyone spoke Guangdonghua,
right, right.
Cantonese, and wasn't a very good environment for studying Mandarin either.
Mm,
So,
mm.
but it was I would say a lot more raw than Hong Kong.
Okay.
Uh, the living conditions were not quite as fancy or nice as they were in
Mm,
Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong was a little bit more advanced at that particular time.
right.
But the people were much friendlier in Taiwan immediately.
Yeah, I would
In
think
Hong
that.
Kong,
Oh,
I rarely
sorry.
met people.
Right, right. I would think
No,
that
go ahead.
Hong Kong is kind of like a New York kind of everyone's on the go all the time, kind of like Shanghai here in the mainland as well. So that's one of the things that I remember picking up in Shanghai is that I just didn't have a good time with people because they seem to be very unfriendly. I know they're always on the go and that's just the way things are, but I would assume maybe Hong Kong is similar in that sense. It's kind of like a New York of Asia at that point. It was at least. So yeah,
It really was.
yeah, very
It was
interesting.
really, really pretty advanced city even at that particular time back in the mid 80s. And I really just love to, after school, go into Hong Kong and have dim sum. And, so just wandering around Hong Kong was a lot of fun. But it was definitely like that big city kind of atmosphere.
I just watched this again. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's probably the movie that influenced me the most with regards to my choice in the martial path. Of course, it influenced a lot of people. Enter the Dragon, and I was wondering if you had that kind of those visions in your head. If you remember the opening sequences of Enter the Dragon, while those guys are going through Hong Kong and they're on those boats and they're arriving there in Hong Kong. I mean that was filmed just I mean probably less than a decade before you arrived there. Did you have similar visions and feelings of that or flashbacks from Enter the Dragon at that time when you first arrived there?
Well, Hong Kong is so big and so busy. I'll be honest, I was pretty intimidated
Okay.
in just being in Hong Kong because coming from the States, a big city like that, I always thought maybe there's like a gang around the corner, waiting for this foreigner to walk by and start some trouble. But that kind of stuff, of course, never happened. I mean, people really didn't care one way or another.
Yeah.
But it did have that real big city vibe. And in Hong Kong, you see a little bit of everything.
Okay.
There's a fair amount of foreigners there, but there's Indian culture there. There's, of course, Chinese culture is the main culture, but it's just a huge city, and I hadn't really lived in a big city like that before going to Asia. So
Well, that's a big step. It's a big step. Sorry, so you moved on to Taiwan and do you continue to pursue your Mandarin studies there?
yeah, and it was much cheaper. When I was in Hong Kong, I really paid a lot of money. I didn't make a good. It wasn't a very. I wasn't thinking clearly when I
Mm,
went to Hong Kong and studied Mandarin at the Chinese Hong Kong University. It was pretty pricey.
okay.
But in Taiwan, it was just literally, I mean, dirt cheap. It was very inexpensive to study Mandarin, and it also provided me an opportunity, contacts to meet people to teach English. So
Okay.
it was real easy to find like the what they call the bushiban,
All right.
where a lot of the English and Chinese teaching went on.
And were you studying Mandarin at any particular institution when you arrived in Taiwan?
Mainly at just these kind of bushiban centers
Okay.
that are basically everywhere. And a lot of times people would go to these particular training centers because they also offered some kind of visa help. You
Okay.
know, if you wanted to stay and you had a job, you didn't have to leave quite as often to renew your visa.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna
Because
ask
when
you.
you first came to Taiwan, you had to leave every
Yeah.
3 months.
Yeah, that was exactly why I was asking because I know what it's like even coming here now into China. If you're going to come on a student's visa, you have to have registered at a recognized, designated place of learning, and then you can come in. But if you don't have that, you're not really. I mean, if you're learning privately, etc., it's quite a lot more difficult with regards. Well, it's almost impossible with regards to visas. I know the USA had a an agreement with China that would allow a 10-year visitor visa, tourist visa that's valid for 3 months at a time. And guys would do what you were doing, what you mentioned about Hong Kong, not what you were doing, that they would do visa runs to Hong Kong and then come back into China. I don't know if that's still viable right now because the whole situation has deteriorated so dramatically in the last year. But that's what I was. That was so at these places that you were learning. I mean, it wasn't such a big issue. I'm sure as an American, it was a little bit easier to get a visa for Taiwan, though.
We did better apparently than the Brits. When I was in Hong Kong,
Mm.
in fact, I had to leave every month when I lived in Hong Kong, and I go to mainland China for
Okay.
my visa. But in Taiwan, yeah, I think the Americans had a better, slightly better deal than the Brits and
Mm.
other Europeans, because I had German friends and that were most likely would leave every 3 months and go to Okinawa or Hong Kong or the closest place possible.
Right.
And usually you could do that in one day. You would just go like you go to Hong Kong for one day, fly back the next day.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just an issue of an exit stamp and an entry stamp again. So that. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's exactly what guys were doing here. They just had to leave the mainland so they could go to Hong Kong, get an exit stamp and an entry stamp, and then that 3 month counter resets. So, yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
It's all about that, just that stamp.
right,
And it was quite a business here in
yeah.
Taiwan, I think,
Here
that whole
too,
process. So,
here too. There's agents that are set up to assist people to do that. So here too, it's also quite a big business. Well, if I may, I was wanting to move on to your martial arts as you arrived in Taiwan, and how did it progress from there?
okay. Well, when I first came to Taiwan, I couldn't find Hong Yixiang immediately. In
Mm.
fact, I went to an area where I thought that he was training at. I remember wandering around in the streets when I first got to Taiwan, and trying to describe to some of the locals that lived around that area that I was looking for this particular, and he's a big guy, so, I would describe him as like kind of a heavy-set guy that taught Xingyi, and most people didn't know what the hell I was talking about, and later on, I really had to laugh at myself because I must have looked incredibly kind of ignorant walking around, and most people were kind of friendly, but nobody really helped me. And I remember I was in a tailor's shop.
Right.
Just kind of half chance walked into this tailor shop, and I was looking around at some of their clothing, and the guy there spoke English, and he said, "What are you doing in Taiwan?" I says, "Well, partially I'm looking for this teacher, Hong Yixiang," and it just turned out that his son was a student of Hong Yixiang's.
Oh, what a coincidence.
And
wow.
At that moment, he said, "And he'll take you there right now if you want to." And I said, "I'm ready."
Nice.
And we took, it took 3 bus rides to get to his place. So this young kid, he was probably about 12 years old.
Okay.
It took me to Hong Yixiang's that evening. And I think it was only because of his introduction, at least that's what they claim later on, is that because they really liked this kid, that they accepted me when I went and found Hong.
Were there other foreigners at that time when you had arrived?
There were when there was in my initial class, there was one guy, Chris Bates,
Okay.
who actually wrote a book called Culture Shock. If you look around for introductory books to Taiwan, you'll see, I think it's called Taiwan Culture Shock.
Okay.
And it was a big book for a lot of people coming to Taiwan. But he was my classmate, and he'd been in Taiwan already a few years, spoke pretty good Mandarin. And I had another British classmate, and we were the only foreigners in the school at that particular time. But having them there really helped me out quite a bit in terms of translation and what have you.
For sure, it's very important. It's very important. Yeah, I was gonna say that the story about you going to the tailor shop, did this ever get transmitted to Hong Yixiang about just the coincidence and the perchance method that you actually got to find him? Did this get transmitted to him? Did he understand this?
I don't think so. It was just kind of something that I would usually never bother them with, the details of my daily life. But it was always that kind of very coincidental type of meeting. I just it stuck in my mind for years that it seemed to be, very, what's the word I'm looking for?
Yuanfen is the word, I think. That's
Yuanfen was a Chinese word, yeah.
Yeah. Fate, destiny. But that's why I was asking,
Destiny.
because that kind of a way of meeting a teacher is a lot of the older generation Chinese, like my teacher as well. They would say, "Well, this is Yuanfen. That's why we actually managed to meet each other." So, I would say that's the same thing with you. That's quite interesting. But yeah, you had gone there with this whole idea in mind, and you ran into obstacles. But then, just by chance, you went into a tailor, and well, destiny took over. So that's probably all part of the bigger picture, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
I remember the BBC, was it BBC? Anyway, it was a British televised series that Hong Yixiang featured in called Way of the Warrior. And you mentioned some of the foreigners that you were training with there. Did Way of the Warrior have an impact on foreigners specifically coming to look for Hong Yixiang?
I would think so. That's probably I would imagine his main connection to the West is through that particular BBC connection. But Yeah, I think, yeah, that's definitely would be the key reason that that and perhaps maybe Kumar's contact with Hung and some of his stories about training there
For
in
sure.
Taiwan.
Yeah, that's also a whole other side of the dissemination of the information regarding Hong Yixiang and his practices is Bruce Kumar's exposure of it to the West. So yeah, these are both interesting points that I'd like to get into if we could. But I'd like to hear what it was like in the beginning time for you when you had just started training with him.
Well, it was, I would say, a pretty casual environment. In Taiwan is very hot, so wasn't unusual for people just to take their shirts off. A lot
Yeah.
of people just running around without a shirt on. It was so sweaty in Taiwan.
Right.
Taiwan's a fairly like subtropical area, so on that level, I was fairly impressed with the training right up front. And we did a lot of standing training, Santi Sure
Right.
training at the beginning, and mainly like 5 elements. I would say, at least for myself, the first 6 months I was there, and but the other classmates I think were friendly. There was also Hong Yixiang had 3 sons,
Mm.
and sometimes all 3 sons were there, and in most cases there was at least one son there, and the youngest son usually ran the class. He was kind of like the class leader at the time,
Okay.
and then the other sons would come in as kind of like instructors besides Hong Yixiang himself.
What age was he at that time when you had arrived there?
I would say he was in his early 60s.
Okay. Yeah, it's still a good
Yeah.
age for these arts. They're still quite, in general, they're still quite powerful, quite able at that age. I mean, I've noticed with my teacher as well, but others as well. Once they hit 70, that they start to slow down a little bit. It's noticeable. But prior to that, I would say my teacher from 50s to 60s, I didn't see much of a difference. So yeah.
Yeah, Hung was very powerful even at that age when I met him.
Mm,
Although he did consider himself to be in his retirement
of
phase
course.
of life at that particular time, and he would mention that fairly often that
Mm.
he'd already retired.
Yeah, and his sons were how old at that? You mentioned his youngest son. Generally, roughly speaking, what?
Yeah, his younger son was probably, I would say, maybe 6, 7 years younger than me.
Okay.
And then he had the older son, Tiger, was maybe a few years older than me. Then he had a middle son
Okay.
who's actually teaching currently in Taiwan now. And he was about my age, I believe.
Okay. All right. And you focused on Xingyi Chen, as you said, predominantly for the initial period and 5 elements, etc. What was his what was Hong Yixiang's training method like? What was his focus? Were there things for him that he stressed, or things that he ensured that people focused on more?
I would say that he was big on standing, so we really did do a lot of standing. In fact, it was that kind of standing that you kind of wonder what the hell you're doing there after a while. It's like, are we going to stand more? And it was so hot as well, and
Yeah.
it made the standing even a little bit more suffering than usual.
Mm.
But he, besides the common core of Xingyi, which we did a lot of wuxing lianhuan.
Okay.
Besides the 5 elements, we practice 5 elements every night, go through all five
Of
elements, and
course.
then always, like the Jibin Gong stuff would be the lianhuan.
Okay.
and maybe Basher, a
Right.
few of the animals. And but besides that, he also taught while I was there. He had white crane from his family
Okay.
and taught us some these three short white crane forms,
Very interesting.
as well as Taiji.
Okay, yeah.
So he taught Chen Panling Taiji, and he taught us the first couple sections of the Chen Panling form, and that was a very important aspect that he thought was a good counter to teach along with his Xingyi, because of the kind of the swaying nature of the Yaobai, as they would call it, that was a different kind of Shenfa than the like half step that you practice over and over again, particularly in the five elements.
Right, right. And you had some Chen Panling experience prior to actually learning it there. You had done a little bit in the USA. How
Yeah, that's primarily what
Yeah.
I did with Kumar.
How different was it? How different? I mean, we always find that once we move into, like, I mean, even for me, I started training Chinese martial arts in the West before I then first started training with Chinese people in the West after that, and then moving to China itself and training directly here. It's quite a big difference in terms of qualitative as well as quantitative training. So was it a bit of a shock to you?
Um, well, I think his, yeah, definitely. I mean, the quality, I would say in general, was better than I was used to,
Yeah.
and the Chen Panling form, however, has a few different variants here in Taiwan. They have basically the family members, Chen Panling himself and his sons, and then you had Wang Sujing,
Okay.
who also taught Chen Panling, and they did a different version. So when I came to Taiwan, I believe Kumar was teaching the Wang Sujing version that was somewhat different than. In fact, I remember showing that to some of Hung's students when I got to Taiwan, and they kind of laughed at me. They said, "Oh, that's not Chen Panling,"
Oh, really?
but they also did a different version than what I was taught. So,
Sure. And you carried on from there, focusing on their curriculum. So, how much of the older curriculum, I mean, obviously, does it even feature anymore in your own practice and your methodology?
well, Hung only taught like the beginning sections of I believe the first two sections of the Chen Panling form.
Right.
Because Xingyi was really the main part of the curriculum, but he wanted people to have a variant kind of body method. And he himself, because he was such a good fighter from close in,
Yeah.
you could see kind of like a lot of Taiji influence in the way that his body moved.
Okay.
And being kind of a bigger guy, half step is one thing, but to be close to him and see his ability to kind of like use this kind of Yao Bai swaying body method was pretty intimidating. So
Yeah.
I think he tried to pass that on to his students.
Do you think that his method, I mean, as far as he was a big guy, do you think his method transfers as well to smaller, shorter, thinner people?
That's a good point. Probably not. Probably not, because his raw power was really something to experience.
Yeah.
And because part of like this kind of ways out, like feeding method, I think that was probably one of the bigger lessons behind the actual curriculum, is getting a chance to feel his power.
Right.
although him being a bigger guy, it's true, it was very difficult to harness that kind of power through a smaller frame.
I've kind of noticed that. I mean, he's very overbearing, like he's overpowering. I could see that. I mean, I've never seen the guy in person, but from the videos and methods that I've seen him portray, that looks like he was a very overbearing in the method that he would approach combat. Is he would completely consume you, and I've noticed that just from my experience. I mean, because Xingyi in a sense and Bagua also is more slanted that way, but I found that smaller guys do have a little bit more difficulty attaining this. And even my teacher used to tell me that when he was young, he was constantly trying to gain weight. He was constantly just trying to gain weight because he realized that if he became bigger bodied, he'd be a lot more effective in the use of his Xingyi and Bagua. It's a skill that if you have the weight and the mass, it uses it exceptionally well.
Exactly. In fact, I went through the same phase. I was pretty thin when I moved to Taiwan, and that kind of bigger pear-shaped body that you saw a lot of these like bigger, more developed practitioners had was something. It definitely wasn't that kind of Western kind of hourglass shape. It was a different kind of heaviness that a lot of us were trying to kind of like emulate. Yeah.
Yeah, my teacher always used to have a saying. He's like, "Xingyi Chen, it makes you like a tank, and if you're small, you're a small tank, but if you're big, you're a big tank. But it's important that you're a tank." That's what he'd always say. But yeah, he used to tell me that when he was younger, he tried to eat more just to try gain weight, and he never successfully gained as much weight as he thought he would. But yeah, that's just how it is. It's just how it is.
Yeah, it's true. And I think with Xingyi, you have so much of this kind of zhuang,
Yes.
this kind of bumping forward that's encased in kind of like the half step and 7-star step methods that it really makes a big difference if you got that weight mass behind you.
Totally, totally. And it goes hand in hand with Bagua too, particularly Cheng derivatives. I would say Yin style derivatives, possibly you could get away with it a little bit less, but with Chen style derivatives, it uses a very similar overpowering mass approach.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I will say though, I mean, although Hong was very big, he had very refined finger movement and kind of nimble ability in his hands, which I was pretty impressed with being a big person, because in fact he had a lot of like finger exercises that he would try to pass on, and I don't think everybody really appreciated it, but later on it really became kind of apparent why that was an important aspect to have. So you have this kind of softness through the hands and refinement through your touch.
Right.
And so his kind of like Zhang and Lian Sui kind of tactile ability was, I would say, pretty advanced, and really something that I remember.
Yeah. So you were saying that initially you did mostly Xingyi Quan. He also taught a little bit of white crane. Do you have any idea what white crane it was derived from, if it was a particular type?
Oh yes, I should know, and there's a couple of variant styles in Taiwan, and I think it's the feeding crane style.
Okay. Yeah, my experience with the Taiwanese white crane people is that it's an extremely high level. It's very well developed on the island. In fact, I would probably say in some aspects it's probably the most developed on the island, even comparatively to. I mean, I know that the people in Fujian are gonna hate what I'm gonna say, but from my experience of the practitioners I've seen on both sides, the Taiwanese guys are of a very high level within their white crane. So that must have been quite a popular style around you.
Yeah, I think especially down south.
Yeah.
And it's almost honestly like a religion. In fact, there are certain kinds of idols and gods
No,
that some of
it
these
is.
people do when they buy through.
Yeah, yeah, it is connected to a spiritual. There is a major spiritual connection with White Crane, and there are rituals that are involved that are religious as well. So yeah, for sure there is. So that's very
Yeah,
interesting.
as a matter of fact, I had a friend that lived down south, and he is also an internal martial arts practitioner who ran into a White Crane guy in the area had been kind of like watching him from kind of like behind the bushes kind of thing, and watching his practice. And one time after they had trained, the guy approached him and wanted to do some push hands or stick hands with him. And he actually ended up breaking my friend's arm.
I know who you're talking about, by the way. I know that
Oh, okay. Okay.
he
Yeah.
he
I
told
didn't want
me
to
he
mention
told me
his
how
name.
his arm got broken as well. So yeah, I know. I heard about
Okay.
this from him. Yeah, but they are very powerful. So there's
So that, yeah, this is supposed to tell you the kind of mindset too that some of these, some of the practitioners have. So
yeah,
you got to
yeah.
be very careful.
Well, I've had that here, and I didn't know it in the beginning, and I might have related this story previously in a previous podcast. But in the beginning time when I had first moved here and was training with my teacher, we had a couple of times that somebody was standing by the wayside and watching, and then he'd approach. And a lot of the most of the days I'm alone with my teacher, apart from the times when other guys would come, which was usually on the weekends. But Monday to Friday, I was alone with my teacher there, and this guy had come up one day and he's like, "Oh, your student, he looks really good," and he's being very polite to my teacher. But my teacher is, he's an old generation. He's heard it and seen it all before, and little to, without me knowing, I didn't really know what was going on. I just thought this was a guy being, inquisitive and friendly. And then he's like, "Do you mind if I do some push hands with your student?" And my teacher's being just as polite, but they're reading each other between the lines, and I didn't know this on the first time. So, you know, um, this guy started doing some push hands with me. Well, just some stuff that he considered push hands. In any case, I didn't overtly attack, but I merely defended myself and neutralized whatever he was doing. He was unsuccessful with whatever he was doing, and for me, I thought, okay, well, this is how you're gonna be. You're gonna be reserved. You're gonna be polite. Don't hurt anyone. And then he went on his way. He just looked at my teacher with a smile on his face. He said, "Your student's good," and he left. And then I went for lunch to my shifu's home right after that. But he was silent, and I didn't understand why. My teacher was just deadly silent right after this, and even up until most of the meal was done. And then he looked at me
Mm,
and he asked me, he said, "Byron, what do you think I want you to do when somebody comes to do that?" And I thought, let me try
mm,
think of the most auspicious answer. Let me try think of, the most wude, the most ethical thing that he wants me to. I'm like, "Oh, you want me to be respectful and hold myself back and don't hurt the guy?" And he said, "No, that's not what I want you to do." He said, "I want you to break the guy because he's trying to break you and he's trying to embarrass me. And I'll reprimand you in front of him, but in my heart I'll be happy." And I thought, Jesus,
mm.
this is a whole other world that you've got to understand. So yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, especially Westerners when they come out here. So, these instances happen.
Yeah, I had a similar experience later on when I was studying with Luo,
Mm,
that in a similar fashion, he kind of castigated a couple of us for not, going all out.
right,
We were surprised, yeah, thinking that, was the better man would be the one, that kind of holds back. But no,
right,
it was, yeah.
right. I think it's because we've been fed these chivalry stories through popular culture and mythic tales of the Chinese martial arts, but reality is quite, quite,
Yeah.
quite different.
In fact, I think, that kind of, behavior, I think, yeah, a lot of people go to Asia thinking that that's the way to handle yourself. But
Right,
in my opinion, if you're gonna, you'll never succeed in Asia if you come with that very kind of like muted, waiting for somebody to offer something. You have to really get out there and be a little bit sometimes overbearing, as a matter of fact, if you want to accomplish what you came for. So
Yeah, totally. I mean, I also remember a few times that foreigners had come and come to, specifically here in the north of China, and they'd come with this idea that Chinese martial artists are these, quasi-monk, vegetarian, they don't drink, they don't do any this and that. And then when I take them for the first time, there's a get-together with a bunch of Xingyi and Bagua old generation people, and they're basically drinking bottles of baijiu, smoking, and it's getting all rowdy. Somebody's inevitably going to have an argument with somebody else, and they're looking at me like, "Oh, Byron, I thought we were just going to drink tea." I'm like, "No, welcome to the Wulin. This is just how it is, really." So they've got these very strange ideas of the reality. That doesn't mean one should go overboard, but they just don't understand the reality. So
that's true. They definitely don't understand that how they're being perceived, and oftentimes I think they're being perceived as being weak.
Yeah.
If you don't want to have a glass of gaoliang or something, it's like, how come you're so weak?
Yeah, totally. That's exactly it. Or also, I'm telling you to drink this, so why aren't you drinking it? That thing too. So, yeah, it's very interesting. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of dinners really go spiral out of, downward because of that exact thing that you're talking about.
Yeah, totally. Well, you were doing Xingyi, and you started doing some Taiji that was Hong Yixiang's method of balancing his Xingyi. Obviously, Xingyi seems to be Hong Yixiang's core practice, what he was teaching the most. How did you get into the Bagua from there?
Well, actually, oftentimes during practice, it wasn't unusual for people to come. Old students would come and visit Hong during practice. And I remember one night, Luo came in.
Okay.
And he was talking with Hong, and I actually had never seen him before, didn't know who he was. And I remember that night we were actually practicing Taiji, Phoenix.
Right.
And Luo had, Hong had asked Luo if he would, help some of the students with the application of Taiji. He came over and helped me, and really just threw me halfway across the room. I don't think I had ever been kind of like manhandled in that particular fashion before. And it was very kind of like a complex kind of application that he pulled out of Phoenix that I had never seen before. And I was immediately like, wow, who is this guy?
Right.
I got to find out who he is. And, I mean, in that kind of environment, you can't really, be too conspicuous. You have to, but I tried to, find out his name, and I remember asking him if he wanted to study English before, thinking that we could
do an exchange.
Get an exchange, and but I had to be very careful, because if you do that kind of stuff abruptly in front of other teachers, you'll get blackballed right away. So.
Yeah.
And again, later on had another Yunfen moment where I had just decided to leave Hong Yixiang's class, and I was in a tea shop about a week after I had quit, and I was really kind of undecisive. I didn't know if I had made the right move, and I was sitting in this tea shop that hardly anybody ever came into, and lo and behold, Lowell showed up in that tea shop.
Very interesting.
He came in, and the first thing he said to me, he says, "You want to learn Bagua?" And I go, "Yeah."
What was there a catalyst that made you stop training at Hong Yixiang school? I mean, is it something you want to get into or not?
Not too deeply into, but I just felt like it was basically after you do something for a number of years, I just needed something. I needed a change, and I really wanted to find a Bagua teacher. And I think Hung was basically his main curriculum was Xingyi at the time. And I felt like I needed, I just needed a change. And being in Asia, I wanted to. It was a tough decision either way. I was really concerned that I made the wrong decision, and I'd only been gone a couple of weeks, and I thought I could always go back if I
Change your mind. Yeah.
But if I changed my mind. But I just when I ran into Luo through this kind of coincidence, fate, then I started training with him.
And his Bagua comes through Hong Yixiang, is correct?
Yeah, Hong Yixiang and some through the Zhang Feng
Lineage.
connection,
Okay.
not through Zhang Feng, but through his wife was teaching
Okay.
after he died. So he did Bai Shi over at that with those people.
Oh, okay. So he is actually carrying two traditions, in fact, through two lines, really.
Well, it depends how you look at it,
Yeah.
because the Hongs were really kind of like the oldest students of Zhang Feng on the
Yeah.
island. So in many ways, it was all what they call Yizong,
Yeah. Yeah, he's on.
I Ching, yeah.
Okay, so
So
yeah, you
Yeah.
moved on to law, and what was that like?
well, for the first year, it was amazing because I basically had them all to myself, and I would meet him a few times a week at a local park,
Yeah.
and he would give me something to practice. And after about a year, I asked him if I could introduce him to people. Like I'd already met like Tim Cartmel and a few other people
Okay.
who were training. Tim was training with some other Tang Shou Dao people
On the island. On the island.
on the island. So I met through some mutual friends. I met him, and so he was one of the people that I originally introduced Luo to after about a year. And I was living on the side of Yangming Mountain in Tianmu in Taipei, outside of Taipei. And I had this fairly sizable open space in the place I was living at. And so we started classes at my house, and one by one, over a couple of year period, the classes started getting fairly large.
Okay.
And so a lot of it was me introducing Luo to different people that I had met, foreigners that I met that were pretty serious about training internal martial arts. And I think everybody that met Luo was really surprised at his skill level.
Yeah, and he's become renowned for it over the years, and he's still held in high regard because of it.
Yeah, he was pretty amazing. I think he still is. I don't train with him currently, but he's been living mainly in Europe the last 7 or 8 years.
Okay.
But he's actually trapped in Taiwan right now because of all this COVID stuff going on. So
Yeah, I think everybody's trapped wherever they are right now because of this COVID thing. Yeah, it's a tragedy. And so with him, you basically just did Bagua. You didn't go back and cover aspects of Xingyi, Chen, etc. You basically focused on Bagua since you started training with him.
No, we did everything actually. We did Taiji, Xingyi, and Bagua.
Okay.
In fact, his interpretation was very instrumental in terms of me advancing in Xingyi, and I would say that's one of the reasons that I left the Hung school. Was I didn't feel like I was getting the fighting experience that I wanted there.
That's an interesting word.
A
Yeah.
lot of times.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
well, a lot of Chinese schools, I mean, they really focus on forms,
Yeah,
and they don't have a bunch of people, really going for it.
right.
So we would have like a advised type of training
Mm.
experiences with Hung, but Luo being younger, I think had a lot to do with it, and so we went through the entire Xingyi curriculum,
Mm.
which was good because I already had experience with Hung, so a lot of the terminology and stuff like that, it was already kind of there,
Right, right.
so we could really focus on applications and other things that I may not have picked up
Perfect.
before that.
Well, maybe it was just the right time for you to start focusing on those aspects. A lot of the time, people think that they want to start doing applications pretty soon, but they a lot of times, if you don't do that, and you actually, I mean, it's not to say this is universal, but I have found that if they haven't set the solid foundation in the methodology and the methods first, then the applications suffer later too. So it could have been that that was just also the correct time. I mean, leaving law out of the equation, maybe the reason why you digested it so well at that point was because you were actually ready to digest it at that point. And this is also something that
No,
people
you're absolutely,
miss. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely right. In fact, I think with Xingyi, you really do need those kind of foundational
Mm.
years of just doing kind of like the, half stepping up one side and back,
Right.
back and forth
Line drills.
over and over again.
Yeah.
Yep, line drills.
Yeah. But I
And
would.
so they really, I think I just got a little bored with that
Right.
type of training, and I needed something else. But I think you're exactly right.
Yeah, so you were ready for it. And the other interesting thing was that you used the word interpretation, which I think is really important because, I mean, you've just said it that Luo Dexiu and Hong Yixiang they're from the same root. In fact, Luo Dexiu also comes through Hong Yixiang and others, but they all come from the same root. Yet their minds and the way they apply their minds to the same teaching is slightly different. So the result will be slightly different too, as you said, the interpretation. It's not to say that one's right or not one's wrong, etc. I think that interpretation aspect, once you have the foundation and the method digested really well, then you can start working on your own interpretation. That's also a very important step. So some martial artists are more gifted than others, and Law is obviously one of those people that is, I'm sure if he had to be compared to his own classmates that he studied with, he stands out. So it's very important.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And we always considered him kind of like a martial arts genius, because I think he could look at things and bring certain aspects out that you just didn't imagine were even there.
Right.
And so yeah, I think that ability to take the art and advance it is something that is, I think good people are still doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. I mean, if I look at the difference even between my teacher and his other martial arts brothers in this regard, even he carries a couple of lineages. His Xingyi lineage, I've only met one or two other people that came from the same teacher, and he's so vastly different. I mean, methodology, basic principles in general are the same, but then what he's done and what he's added to it and refinement is so different to the others. He's like not just head and shoulders. He's like head, waist, and shoulders, everything above his own brothers and classmates in that regard. So it does matter who's doing the digesting as well.
Yeah. And yeah, I should also note that Lowell really did bring in a lot of the qualities that I found in Hung himself, because Hung was a very kind of close-in fighter, really grappling type of style.
Yeah.
And that was something I think Lowell really brought to the table as well. And you could see that kind of the influence between from Hong to Luo in terms of
Sure.
that kind of grappling style.
You know, I was actually thinking a little bit now about what you said, that Law decided to, and he himself focused a lot more on getting out there and with his students, testing, showing, getting them to feel the applications, which you said was a contrast to even the way Hong would structure his classes. And being younger is one aspect, but do you think that the post World War II Japan issue that had permeated on the island as well, in terms of the dissemination of Japanese martial arts on Taiwan, might have influenced law that, this needs to be focused on and developed. Otherwise, a lot of these Chinese arts will be left behind in the face of the methods that the Japanese arts do, because they're very much more into the hands-on, kind of application heavy training.
Probably because I think, Luo's generation was right at the cusp
Yeah.
of that kind of transition in Taiwan from that very kind of like Japanese influence to a kind of newer generation,
Yeah.
which in the newer generation was definitely more keyed in on kind of having that more Chinese expression, I think, of the system. In fact, it really the Chinese tradition early on here is very palpable. It's kind of penetrated everything to the way that people would take their shoes off at the front door and all that kind of stuff, and manners and etiquette and all that type of thing.
Right.
And the newer generation was a little bit, I would say, a little bit more wild in many ways.
Okay. That's interesting. And
Not as subdued.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just said, not as subdued. Maybe wild wasn't the right word, but
Free.
not quite as subdued.
Free. Yeah.
Free. That's probably better. Yeah.
Yeah, so you moved onto Law's methods, and that's how you. What would you say from then on out? I mean, you practiced everything Xingyi, Bagua, and Taiji with him, but yourself, in terms of your own focus from there on out, what did you find your focus to be more leaning towards?
Well, because I have a Chinese medical background, I was as well interested in the cultivation end of the practice. And fortunately, Luo also had a background in Chinese medicine. He was considering becoming a Chinese doctor at some point, and then went in another direction. But he had that basic understanding and I think love for the cultivation end as well.
Okay.
So to some degree, the way I looked at Taiji, Xingyi, and Bagua were all kind of, Taoist cultivation systems. And I would always, spend as much time as possible as well to kind of like get any information I could in terms of the relationship to the cultivation end of the practice.
Okay.
So that was an important part for me, because I was also studying apprenticing with different Chinese medical doctors at the same time that I was doing the apprenticeship with Luo.
Right. So you continued your studies with that too.
Oh yeah. I was pretty busy for 8 or 9 years there, just doing apprenticeships with people.
Was there any particular field of Chinese medicine that you focused on?
Well, I ran into a doctor. I was apprenticing at a hospital in Taipei, and it was actually the part of the hospital where they do this kind of birthing medical practice protocol.
Okay.
That you prepare a woman before and after with different kind of herbal herbal soups and what have you.
Okay.
But when I was there, I met one apprenticing doctor that was a pulse diagnosis expert, and he had his own clinic. And I ended up spending 6 or 7 years apprenticing with him, and learned his pulse diagnosis system, and then went on to translate some of the books that he had written in Chinese. And I was very interested in that when I returned to the West later on, and spreading that particular type of pulse diagnosis method, which is essentially a method of using pulse diagnosis with herbs and acupuncture. So, however, pulse diagnosis is, I don't think it really went over that well.
In the West, or?
In the West, yeah.
You know, it's quite.
Because
it's quite. Maybe it would benefit to give the listeners just a very brief breakdown of what pulse diagnosis is, because I'm sure a lot of them don't know what that is.
Well, pulse diagnosis is generally these days it's palpating the radial vessel on the near the wrist,
Yeah.
where people in the West would generally like feel your pulse. There's that section of the radial vessel is broken into 3 segments, and in most cases, if you say ba mai, which is like ba means to like use your hands to
Right.
like grab something. Mai is vessel, and it's kind of like another way to even talk about Chinese medicine in general.
Right.
You know, you say, did you go? Did somebody ba need a mai?
Yes,
Did
exactly.
you go see like just kind of code for like? Did you see a Chinese doctor?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because when I first came to China, to Beijing, I mean, it's almost like 2002, one of the first times I came here. So we're going on to almost 20 years ago. But I went to a hospital, and it was a lot more prevalent than it is now. It's still prevalent, but not as much, that most hospitals were combined. So they were combined Chinese and Western medicine. It wasn't either or. Nowadays, there's lots of specialist clinics set up, which are, a lot of them are just cashing in on the novelty and renewed vigor of nationalistic ideas of Chinese things. But when I went to a doctor, for example, back then, even in a normal clinic then, and they said to me, all right, what are you feeling? And I'd say, well, I've got this and this issue. The first thing they would do is say, okay, give me your wrist. And they would sit there and they would do exactly what you're saying. They would feel my pulse on that vessel and start diagnosing from there. And that was how it was. It's just how I used to, that's how I used to go. I was used to going to doctors, and that's what they would do. First was that, and then if from there he felt that you needed, for example, an MRI or a blood test or something, then he'd go on from there. And but a lot of them were trained in both.
Yeah, I think that perception of the public of getting your pulse palpated is a very important type of induction method into Chinese medicine. If you don't get your pulse read, you're probably going to feel like you got cheated in some way.
Right.
Having the doctor kind of feel your pulse, I think, also gives the patient that kind of trust, and this the immediate contact where somebody's actually reaching out and touching you, where in most cases you don't get touched very often. So it's a kind of a bond as well. But I think traditionally, even though a lot of Chinese doctors you find really don't know that much about pulse diagnosis, they're going to do it anyway.
Right.
And they'll a lot of their information is coming through these what they call like the 4 inspections, and
the tongue.
It's like inspecting. Yeah, the tongue, the pulse, questioning. So these 4 types of inspection that the doctors will go through, and that can, and I think most doctors are going to get most of the information through these kind of the totality of these inspection methods. Mm-hmm. Yet you want the patient to believe that you're obtaining everything just through the pulse.
Okay.
But good people can actually do that. And the fact that the person that I spent all the years apprenticing with, I mean, that was his thing. It's just that that was the key method of diagnosis, was the pulse. And but it takes a lot of time. It's just very subtle.
Yeah.
And so if you're not doing it on an everyday basis, like feeling hundreds of pulses a week, it's something that it's very difficult to develop. And when I went back to the West and tried to teach it, I mean, it was not very successful. I think basically because of that aspect of what you really needed to do to develop that type of skill. So.
Okay. So you were training with Luo. You said you started introducing a lot of people, such as names like that some people would know, like Tim Cartmel, etc. And I mean, a lot of them have gone on to disseminate a lot of his teachings in the West too. So what made you, and when did you decide after all the training? I mean, I'll come back to the training a bit in a bit, but you mentioned now that you went to the West as well with this. With your Chinese medical aspect that you were trying to disseminate there. When did you decide to go back to the West, and now you're back in Taiwan, so how did that happen?
I left after, I think, 9 years in Taipei. I just, because originally I had no idea that I would spend that much time in Asia.
No,
in fact,
no one ever does.
I originally thought I would spend a year, a year, and go back with all the goods, and and I would be happy. But what you find out is that, if you're just getting the information through a teacher's English, which isn't going to be as good as their Chinese, that you find out you have to learn the language. You really have to learn the language so that you can get kind of like the information directly in that language. And then a lot of people will begin writing too. I remember thinking I'll never spend all this time like on the writing aspect, but sooner or later, it kind of catches you. You just kind of catch the bug, and you start writing.
Well, it comes out of necessity.
Reading. It's a necessity, yeah. And if you want to do research, you really have to read as well. So that's an important part. But I really came to the point where it's like, I realized that I came to Asia in order to kind of like bring this information back to, my homeland, so to speak. So when I finally decided to leave, which is about 9 years later, that was just it. And I was really, I think at some point, I'm sure you've experienced this, is just that you have to have a change of location. You need something different in your life.
Yeah.
And that was it. And I really kind of like, at that point, I really wanted to go back to the West. And that was it. And I went back, and I eventually started practicing medicine again. But what really helped me was when I came back to the West, is my Chinese martial arts practice was the thing that basically enabled me to make a living.
Okay.
Yeah, because I had to get licensed and everything when I came back to the States. All the rules and regulations had already changed, and the saturation of Chinese medicine into the West it just went, crazy. So it was like coming back to a completely different world.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, I think I spent too much time doing that initial research in Asia, because by the time I came back, it was really kind of like already becoming somewhat mainstream in the West. And then I had to get licensed, and that took me quite a bit of time. in preparing for the test and becoming board certified,
Right.
and it's a business. It's a real business too. So
Yeah.
it's not that the most skilled people are successful. It's the people that know how to do business are the most successful,
So
generally
it's the
speaking.
same with everything. Definitely with martial arts too. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. But I have a saying sometimes, and it's quite. It doesn't mean everybody's like this, but I have a saying like this. Usually the fart that's the loudest stinks the most. But you have to learn that with experience, unfortunately. So a lot of the times people don't realize this. It doesn't mean that the person you've heard of him or you know of him, he's genuinely the best person at whatever he's doing. Sometimes the ones you've never heard of and never seen are the best at it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think when a lot of people come to Asia, they can get sucked in very easily by people that,
Yeah.
have, you know, a big mouth and can really kind of influence you, but you may be making a mistake, so.
Totally, totally. So where were you located when you went back to the States? And you were teaching, so I mean how long were you there for when you went back?
I went back for 8 years
Okay.
and then came back here in 2002. So I went back. I moved probably a dozen times.
Really?
I lived in Florida. I should have stayed in Florida. Florida was a great place, and but fortunately, I made a little money teaching, and I had a friend that was a Chinese doctor there, and I worked in his clinic for a while. But a friend of mine influenced me to go to Austin, Texas.
Oh, okay.
And then I went to Austin, Texas for probably 6 months, and I really didn't like it there. It was too hot.
Really hotter than Florida?
And um, yeah, well, it was for me anyway. And the atmosphere in Austin is kind of a bigger city atmosphere.
Hmm.
And yeah, I never really kind of like fit in that Austin area.
Okay.
Although there's a lot going on there at the time.
Right.
It was a fun city as well. But from there, I heard from some old friends of mine in Denver, and I ended up going back to Denver.
Okay.
And then from Denver, I went to Boulder
Oh, right.
and Colorado Springs, which they're all about 50 miles apart, but I spent most of my time between Denver, Colorado Springs, and Boulder when I was living in the States. When I finally got settled, I settled down in Boulder for most of the time. And that was a great place too. It's a really beautiful place. And some of these beautiful places that are kind of paradises like Boulder, though, after a while, you just wonder what you're doing there. And I made the mistake of leaving. My last year, I moved to Oklahoma.
Oh, that's a big change.
Oh, it was a huge change. It's a completely different environment, even though they're like one state over.
Yeah. So what made you
Yeah,
return to Taiwan?
well, when I was in the States, I actually had the opportunity to open a number of different Chinese medicine schools. And when I went to Oklahoma, as a matter of fact, I was there to teach Chinese martial arts in a friend of mine's studio there. He's also spent quite a bit of time in Asia, and also opened a Chinese medicine school.
Okay.
And so everything actually went pretty well. The school got going, and we started getting students, and the preparation for these things are pretty exhausting. But I actually decided to go to Taiwan and to get some equipment that we needed for the school.
Okay.
And when I came back, my partner met me at the airport and said, I closed the school while you were in Taiwan.
Geez, why?
And it really took... What's that?
Why did he do that?
I really have no idea. something that's probably not even worth talking about
Okay.
on this podcast,
Okay. Okay.
but it really took me by surprise, and it kind of shocked me to the degree which I had just returned to Taiwan, and I actually was staying with my old girlfriend who hadn't married yet, and so it was easy at that point just to leave the States.
Right.
And so, yeah, I decided to come back to Taiwan at that point.
And you've been there ever since, huh?
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Well, that's, I mean, obviously just the way the cookie crumbles. But I mean, are you happy being there? I mean, do you look back at it and still kind of think that you want to go back to the States, or you think you're going to stay in Taiwan?
Well, I think there's good and bad. You know, I really like the States because it's very spacious. Um, if you want to go for a hike or something like that, I mean, there's really the opportunity just to be in some magnificent areas. And Taiwan is nice too, but it's so much smaller. And so usually the neighborhood that you tend to live in, I think you spend most of your time in, and things start to feel very small.
Right.
Feel like I think you live in the mainland, so you may not have that same experience. But in Taiwan, the last few years, I've really been into snorkeling.
Okay.
And so I spent a lot of time in the summer riding over the mountain and down to the ocean, which is a pretty nice ride, and snorkel like a few times a week if I can.
That's very nice.
But yeah, the second time back here is much different than the first time. And when I first came back, I actually was pretty successful in my own little martial arts business and medical practice here.
Oh, okay. Very good.
But yeah, so but the legality of the situation has changed since then. So I've really had to, I can't even really publicly, talk about those kind of things anymore.
Really?
So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I think the whole world is, I mean, even here, things have changed over the last few years to a tremendous degree. So it's interesting to see where everything's going. But, well, I mean, you continue teaching. Did you have a group of, when you were back in the States, did you have a group of dedicated students? Were there any of them that had stuck it out with you for a long time that went on to teach in their own right?
Yeah, I tried to set it up such that I had like three groups from the longest students that I had there that they were with me for the longest time, and when I was in Boulder. And so I kind of broke it up into three groups, and there's one group I believe in Boulder that's still
running,
still running. And I also set it up, when I went back to the States, I brought Luo in to teach a number of times. So he ended up kind of being like on a yearly basis would go back to the States and hit all these spots where, he had students, and Denver was one of those areas. So
I think I've heard of a Yizong group out of Boulder or Denver or something, and that Luo has gone there. So it's probably the same group.
Yep, that's the group. Yeah.
Okay. Was there connection with any of the other Yizong guys in the States? Because they are different. I mean, obviously you've got different connections that come out. Like I think Vince Black's group was one of the earlier groups. You've got I think Tom Bizio was also connected in one way or the other to this the Yizong and the system and the line. Of course, you've got Tim Cartmel. And I'm sure there's a few others. Tim Cartmel, Tim Cartmel and some others. Did you guys interact at all? Is there any interaction between all these disparate groups anymore?
Well, early on, a couple years after Luo started teaching at my place on Yangming Mountain, the Bagua Journal came out to Taiwan. And that's where Tim and another classmate, Bill Tucker, they hooked up with Tim Tim was already in, I think, Taiwan probably a year, maybe even 2 years earlier than I was.
Right.
Spoke pretty good Mandarin. Even when I first came to Taiwan, his Mandarin was pretty good. And he hooked up with the Bagua Journal people. I think Dan Miller was the guy running the journal at the time. And then they went to the mainland together.
Yeah.
Vince Black also came out with Dan Miller and met Lowell at the time. And they also wanted to kind of like, they were earlier on into the Tang Shou Dao, which Hong Yixiang had a connection to. And I think they kind of came out as well to interview Hong and to kind of like to see, you know, what the original teacher, like the Tang Shou Dao group was like.
Right.
And I think for a couple of years, there was some bit of communication and connection between these various groups, but I don't think that they lasted very long. And things got somewhat dispersed, and I don't think even Lowell goes back to the States as much as he used to. And he's in Europe most of the time now.
Okay. Well, also everyone's getting on in age as well, so these things happen. I mean,
That's
Vince
right.
Black is also not with us anymore.
That's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, Vince Black and Tom Bizio actually, when they came to the mainland, I mean, Vince Black, if you know, has a connection to my grand teacher, Li Ziming, with his Bagua. But the reality is Li Ziming is pretty old, and a lot of the teaching was done by his students. And his core 8 original disciples, one of them was my teacher. So, Wang Shitong was one of the guys that was teaching that first group of people that came out from the Bagua journey, teaching them the Liang style Bagua. And Vince and Tom did some Xingyi with my teacher. So I recall that. And my teacher also speaks quite fondly of Vince, saying he's very big, very strong, and he can drink like a trooper. So that was his recollection of Vince Black. But yeah, but they're all getting on in age. I mean, as is everybody. So, you know, these things happen.
I think Vince also got a copy of the manuscript, Li Ziming's this book of Kojie.
Yeah.
These these Bagua poems, right? And so he brought that back to the States, and they published that here.
Yeah. I mean, I know all about that. I mean, we're still very much, the Liang family is still quite close knit, especially with the first group of the first generation of Li Ziming's disciples. So we're still in direct contact, especially with, Li Ziming's daughter over the last few years. Li Xiuren has been actively trying to promote the legacy of her father, which is a good thing. I mean, she's just trying to keep that flame alive in terms of just general marketing type of thing, just keeping things out in the light there and to shed light on all of that, to just keep it in the public eye. So that she's been pretty active in that sense. So yeah.
Well, you've helped spread that as well, right? Didn't you do your last podcast on the Li Ziming legacy?
Yeah, I did. I've started to translate that documentary that was made for his 100th birthday. So I'm releasing that in parts. It takes a bit of time to do the subtitling for that. But yeah, I'm trying to do as much as I can too. But it's not specifically just about my family. Although, I mean, I am trying to shed light on those methods too. But in Chinese martial arts as a whole, because it's just been under attack for the most part over the last 5 years. And the parts that are under attack, in many respects, they should be under attack, but then everybody clumps all the other good parts and all the good practitioners and all the good things in Chinese martial art. They clump it together and they think it's just all worthless. So it's time that people see a little bit more. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of practitioners out there. There's a lot of value to these things, and we shouldn't get distracted by just a few bad instances. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's really good that you've become as visible as you have been. I think you're kind of like the standard these days for the presentation of like high quality material that's coming through China into the West, and it's really great to see your the work that you've put into this stuff. So
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm trying.
I
I'm
was
trying.
surprised you wanted to contact me.
Well, for me, for me the key is that there are people that have been in, like I said earlier, there are people that have been deeply involved in these things, and we just don't know about them. And the experiences and the insights that they have, like yourself, are valuable, and they're more valuable now for the newer generation than people actually realize. So, we can use the digital age and all the tools that we have at our disposal to do something positive and productive. So I'm just trying to do that. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, you made a huge impact.
Well, thanks. I'm glad. I'm glad. And this is one of the other topics I wanted to touch on with you. I mean, we've covered a lot of your history and what you've done and what got you where you are today. But for me, what I'd really like to hear from you is the value of these arts looking back up until today, and the value for you going forward. Maybe even how things have changed for you over these years, just in terms of practice.
Well, I think the value is the value is great. However, as you mentioned, the Chinese martial arts is really getting a lot of bad press recently, and which is kind of sad to hear. Yet, I think as a system of martial art that also contains this kind of inner healing system, I think is unlike any other kind of martial program. It's at least very unique on that level. I'm sure there's other systems that promote the healing aspect as well, but that often, particularly these days, doesn't get as much attention, I think, is all of the Taoist kind of practices that kind of come out of these particular internal martial arts. And I found in the States, I mean, at least in teaching, not everybody. In fact, I would say only a smaller percentage were interested in the martial arts. Most people wanted to do it as something to do for their health.
Right.
And so even doing things like circle walking and stuff like that, I think meets the needs of a lot of people that are looking for something that's a little bit unique in terms of fulfilling their appetite of exercise,
Right.
and staying healthy. So, I think these arts really, they keep on giving. I mean, they can really be broken down into several different aspects of looking at the cultivation end of things, and such that, you have the Qigong and the Donggong all kind of wrapped up the moving and still meditation practices that I think a lot of people in the West are looking for. And as well that, in the East, which really is predominant in terms of what you see people practicing, in the parks and in basically everywhere in the morning in Asia, people are practicing some kind of like Qigong or martial art or something like that. So, and I think Bagua, Xingyi, and Taiji, they still have a pretty good reputation in the East.
Yeah, for sure.
People really respect it. But I really think that, for the average person that doesn't really consider themselves a fighter or think that they'll ever get in a fight, these arts are very useful for that type of person, because there's just so much kind of internal cultivation aspects that I think a lot of people, they don't really care at all if they learn applications, fighting applications. They really just care about staying healthy. So it's kind of the yoga of China, so to speak, the way I look at it. So
Yeah, for sure there is that. And I mean, you mentioned something that is quite important, like it's got this element and that element, which is something that's quite unique. It's a holistic type of a training. So that's for me one of the values of Chinese martial arts. Like, it is the exercise. If you do it correctly, and this is also a key point, that if you do it correctly in full, it is a complete exercise. You don't need to use supplementary methods in general, because if you're doing the system and you're doing the curriculum in full and correctly, everything is done there. So this is for one, I think one benefit that the West can really look into, as opposed to I'm going to go do my cardio now and then I'm going to go do my strength now, and both of them are pretty boring as they are anyway. Whereas here you'll probably get to work both of these things, probably not to the same intensity as you would separately, but as time goes on it accumulates, and that's the real value. But at the same time, when we talk about internal, a whole lot of people just simply think about, esoteric magic. While at the end of the day, we don't even have to, that's like putting the cart before the horse. You've just got to use the correct intention, the correct aspects that we have direct teaching and control over, and all those other benefits will come out of them as a result or as a side effect. So all of these things together, they have a psychological, a spiritual, and a physical effect on the person who practices them, as long as they're done correctly. So yeah, like you said, whether somebody thinks he wants to fight or not, if he's practicing these traditional arts correctly, it doesn't matter. He's going to get the same benefits to a large degree. And that's the beauty of it. So,
yeah, so you get this kind of three-part type of practice where, you have the physical practice, but you also have the mind aspect of that. And for the more esoteric, people, we have this kind of thing called qi. So there's kind of three different aspects that you can kind of involve yourself in. And if you're doing like yourself, these different varieties, I mean, they really do offer kind of like a completely different kind of program. For each. Xingyi is so much different than Bagua, and Bagua is so much different than Taiji, and so as in combination or apart, they're like a complete healing system, really.
Yes, indeed. And that was also one thing that I wanted to ask you. Did you find that the progress, the order in which you learned things actually had a positive effect? For example, that the core base was Xingyi, and then you moved on to, later on you moved more onto Bagua. Had it been the other way around, do you think that the result would have been the same?
Probably not. That's a good point. As a matter of fact, I think Xingyi should be kind of like a prerequisite for Bagua, because there are so many kind of in common points where I personally perceive Bagua as being maybe a fuller representation of what's in Xingyi, but you definitely have this kind of like Zhang type of training that is very unique to Xingyi right at the start. That and then Bagua, you got this kind of moving gong kind of circle practice thing that's very unique. But these days, personally, I mean, when I teach people, I like people to start out with Taiji.
Okay.
Just because I think it's a good kind of grid for people to go through.
All right.
I think it's a little bit easier in some ways, even though real traditional training of Taiji isn't easy by any measure.
For sure.
But it at least gets you kind of started in the internal martial arts kind of way of looking at things. And but that's just my own personal preference. And but yeah, I definitely think the progression is very important. And I think as well, I mean, if you come to Asia or wherever you are, and if you don't have a martial arts background, you'll probably have to go back after you complete your training in Bagua or Xingyi or whatever it is, and kind of have to go for even something more basic. And I think that's what happens in Asia a lot, is that people that have never done a martial art will come here and they'll do Bagua.
Yeah, for sure. It's the wrong decision.
They've never even taken, had a kickboxing class or something like that. And I find that oftentimes what they have to do is go full circle, because they'll be missing a lot at the end if they don't have that kind of basis in which to enter these internal martial arts with.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because a lot of the time I take it for granted that I had a background in other martial arts before I went into Xingyi, and then I based everything on Xingyi before I went on to Bagua. I followed my teacher's course that he followed, and he himself started off with what was considered village Shaolin. It was labeled as village Shaolin, and before his teacher started teaching him Xingyi, and then he went on to Bagua. So a lot of the time when I see people and I get perplexed by their understanding of an art, like there's something missing when they're doing Bagua or whatever, a lot of the time I take it for granted that they had the similar background, when most of them don't. They're just, like, as you said, they go from nothing to Bagua, and you miss a lot. You actually miss some very important core components, and the end result is not the same. So you've nailed it there.
Exactly. I found the same thing for, in terms of learning Taiji, Xingyi, and Bagua as well. If you have a medical background, your perception of these things are going to be much different than the person that comes in and doesn't know that kind of like that basic nomenclature. So, and I find a lot of people that come here won't really understand that what they're doing might be considered a form of Qigong, only because they don't have the background for understanding, what Qigong really is. If somebody, this is Qigong, you okay, but if you come in with that background, and if you're talking to a teacher that has that background as well, I think you'll pick up, a different, a deeper level of some of these practices, just because you have the background. If you don't, then you're gonna have to go, start over again.
Yeah.
And kind of learn things later on.
Right. Actually, there was quite an interesting thing, because we've seen that, like, one of the key people in the movement to get Xingyi into a more public position, starting in the early 1900s, was Sun Lutang, with his publication of his Xingyi book. It was the first mass-produced, published book on the art, and he did himself, and even after that, in the book and after that, he did go a little bit more deeply into the medical side of the basis of a lot of these practices, and he himself was heavily focused on this, especially as he got older in his life. And I was doing a bit of research about what led to this, and there was a key person that is in his past that is not really spoken about, and it's a older generation practitioner named Bai Xiyuan. Bai Xiyuan was actually in the Qing imperial court. He was a doctor. He was a Chinese medical doctor, and he was also one of Li Luoneng's students, the founder of modern Xingyi. And he himself had developed an entire practice based on his understanding of Chinese medicine and movement medicine. So he connected these things, and he actually did write what you'd call a quanpu, or a note, or a book on this issue. And Sun Lutang did learn from him, and Sun Lutang did get this book. So I think it had a very profound effect on Sun Lutang's future as well, that led him to go more deeply into this. But he's a figure that's not really spoken of much, not really well known, but he's probably one of the key reasons for that. So.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'd never heard that myself. So
yeah, it just
makes perfect sense.
It's something I looked into more recently, because I wanted to look at the histories of what we actually had of some of the older generation practitioners, to try and understand the directions that they went. And this name popped up, and his history was very profound in that sense. So it made a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah, and the Sun Lutang stuff is the alchemical practices in there. It really makes sense that he probably had some, Chinese medical background to go in that direction.
Right, exactly, and yeah, that figure is Bai Xiyuan. That's the person that I think was the key person that influenced him in this regard. So it's just quite interesting. Yeah. So I'd
like to hear more about him.
Well, I have spoken about this before. I've been writing a book on translation of the quanpu that my teacher has in his possession. with explanation. I've been doing that for over 80 years, and it's just been going on and on. I'm sure you know what that's like. But I've decided that I want to try finish it this year, and part of it has some biographies of people, and this will be in there. What I found about Bai Xiyuan. It's not an in-depth biography of all these people by any means, but at least it gives you a general overview of some of the more key figures in the line of Xingyi from Li Lonong down. So,
wow, I can't wait for that to come out.
hopefully I'll get it done in the next few months. I hope so. So.
Are you gonna publish it and sell it online, or
yeah, I'll probably self-publish it. I'll probably self-publish it. So it's quite a large amount of work. I mean, I translated a lot of texts that are common, but some of them that aren't common, and then I've added explanations. So it's quite an in-depth book. It's not a teaching book per se, because I'm not going into how to do Xingyi. I'm going into the texts that were handed down and trying to explain what they meant, along with notes to explain certain terms, ideas, history of certain things, etc. So it's more going to be valuable to practitioners as a supplementary document to reference as you go through training. But yeah, hopefully it'll be done.
Yeah, all of those side notes are probably just immense,
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Yeah, a lot of them are. For example, I did the Neigong Sijing, which is it's a book. Well, it's a document that's handed down in the Song family, and that's really only handed down in the Song family. And it's a very esoteric text, to be honest. That was a very difficult text to translate. But some of the sections are very short, and the footnotes are like 5 times as long, because you need to have so much background to understand what they're talking about there. You know, there's a lot of I Ching references and other things too. So if you don't know what they're talking about, it's not going to make any sense. So at least I'm trying to just open that door for English-speaking practitioners, and then they can go in deeper on their own if they feel like it. So.
Yeah, well, you're lucky to be kind of close to the source, so you can, when you find esoteric information like that, you can probably bounce it off people that have some background in that, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, it's not easy, because also it's classical Chinese, and a lot of people don't understand that doesn't just mean the traditional characters, it means the way of writing and speaking. And thankfully my teacher is fluent in that, so I get stumped on certain things, and he's a great help with helping me understand what was trying to be conveyed there. Sometimes I'll come up with an understanding that's so complex, and then I'll ask him as just to pick his brain on it. He's like, no, it's just this. It's that simple, So there's a lot. It's quite an involved process.
Yeah, you need annotations for the annotations on some of that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's tricky.
Yeah. Well, it's been it's almost we're going on to 2 hours now, and it's been great hearing your story. I just wanted to ask you if there's anything you'd like to leave, anything that you'd like to cover that we haven't covered, anything you'd like to say in closing.
I think we've covered just about everything. In closing, I'd just like to say, I appreciate your invitation
The pleasure
to
was
do
mine.
this interview. And I also appreciate the work that you're, bringing to the public's attention, man. It's really on another level.
Well, thank you for that, and the pleasure was all mine. I had a great time chatting with you, and I'm glad we got around to doing this. If there's any methods that people can contact you, what is the easiest way for people to get in contact with you if they want to?
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel.
Okay.
And that's probably the easiest way to contact me. I've had Facebook up for years, but I've never paid attention to my Facebook, and I have to say, like, sorry to any people that have tried to contact me through Facebook and I haven't answered them, because it's just one form of communication that I never really got into. So,
okay.
Yeah, leave me a message on the YouTube channel is probably the best way to get in touch with me, because I do like to contact with people that are interested in this stuff. So,
all right. What I'll do is I'll get your YouTube channel address. I'll put it in the show notes on this, so people can go directly and find the link. And after this, if there's any other links, etc., you want to put, we'll put them in the show notes, so then people can make use of them.
Okay, great, Byron.
All right. Well, thanks again, and you have a good rest of the day. And yeah, we'll be in touch.
Okay, man. Take care of yourself.
You too.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.